Hi, folks. This is just a reminder that if you like this content, you can help me out by liking, commenting, and especially subscribing to the video. And be sure to hit the bell notification when you do so that you always get notified whenever I have a new video out, whether it's Mysterious World or something else. These days, I usually have several videos out a week. Hope you enjoy this.
Welcome back to Catholic Answers Live. I am Cy Kellett, your host. Jimmy Akin is our guest, and we continue, as promised, with Open Forum, Internet Open Forum, for Jimmy Akin. All of these questions came for Jimmy via the Internet, and we gathered them up and brought them in here, and I'm going to read them, and Jimmy's going to answer them. And I was just reading you one before we went from Clare, that Almighty Living, she was talking about the collect, one of the collects of the Mass, Almighty Living God who governs. She didn't like the use of the multiple, or, the plural verb with the singular noun.
Subject.
Yeah. And you were...
Yeah, and I had a memory slip as I was giving the answer, so I wanted to revisit it. The key verb in Latin for this is moderares, which it's cognate with moderate in English, but govern is fine. And I had said my memory slip was that moderaris is plural. It's not. It's singular. And that of itself clears up the entire thing, because it's omnipotens sempiterne Deus, omnipotent and ever-living God, qui, who, moderaris, who governs. And so if it's translated in English as who govern, that's simply a mistake in the English translation. It is a singular verb in the Latin matching with the singular subject, Almighty and ever-living God.
Claire, I say you take this to the competent authorities and report this. Thank you, Claire. An error. We've got ourselves an error. Jimmy Mark wants to know this one.
Okay.
Why do you think Jesus wasn't more straightforward and left no argument on who he is? God.
I think there are several reasons for this. One of them is he didn't want to cause a problem too soon. He wanted to be able to conduct his ministry. He wanted to be able to heal people. He wanted to be able to preach the gospel. He wanted to be able to travel around. And if right out the gate he started claiming to be God, they would have done to him at the beginning what they did to him at the end. Because there was an idea in Judaism at the time that was shared by some Jews that in addition to Yahweh, God in heaven, there's also a second power in heaven who sometimes was called the second Yahweh or the lesser Yahweh. And this figure was identified with the Son of Man in Daniel 7, where Daniel sees this vision of heaven. He sees the Ancient of Days, meaning God, seated on a throne, and he sees other heavenly beings seated on thrones. And then up to the Ancient of Days comes one like a Son of Man riding on a cloud. And riding on a cloud is divine imagery. The Old Testament talks about how Yahweh rides on clouds. And so this other figure who's then given dominion over the entire earth rides up to the Father or rides up to God on a cloud and is given this everlasting dominion over everything. And he's this heavenly being. And so that to many Jews that's the lesser Yahweh. That's the second Yahweh. It's another divine power in heaven, comparable only to God himself. And but this two powers in heaven doctrine, as it's now called, was not received by everybody. You had other people who thought, no, there's just one power in heaven. It's not more than one. And so then if you look in Mark 14, when Jesus is on trial before the high priest, they're trying him and they're having trouble getting a charge they can use to condemn him, because just claiming to be the Messiah, they expected a Messiah. There's nothing wrong with claiming to be the Messiah. The question is, are you though? And so the high priest, since they're having trouble getting a charge to attack Jesus on or to condemn him on, the high priest says, tell us plainly, are you the Son of the Blessed or not? And Jesus says, I am, and henceforth, meaning from now on, you're going to see the Son of Man coming with the clouds of heaven. And he's referring to Daniel saying, I'm that guy in that vision. I'm the second Yahweh. And at that point, the high priest tears his clothes and says, you've heard the blasphemy, let's do him in. And similarly, in John's gospel, Jesus earlier talked about how he's the Son of God, making himself equal with the Father, and that led to a near lynching attempt. So one of the reasons that Jesus didn't talk about this more clearly and more openly and more regularly is because he didn't want more lynching attempts. He wanted to be able to go conduct his ministry until the time was right for him to go to the cross. So that's one reason he wasn't clearer about it. Another reason, or another factor to consider here, is that he did make it clear to those he was close to. He gave them, not necessarily from the beginning, but he gave them enough information that they would realize who he was, as the gospel authors clearly do realize that Jesus is God and portray him that way. I also think there's a third reason, and that's that if he just came out and regularly said, I am God, it would cause confusion, because in the Jewish mind, the term God was largely tied to the Father. And so if he said, particularly for Jews who did not have the two powers in heaven doctrine, they think of God as, there's just the one God, and that's who Jesus speaks of as the Father. And so if he said, I'm God, it could mislead people into thinking Jesus is saying he's the Father.
Yeah.
And he's not the Father, he's the Son.
Yeah.
So since the term God was so exclusively associated in many minds with the Father, he's not going to just easily say, I am God, without further clarification, because that would make people think he's claiming to be the Father, which is actually a heresy. That's the heresy of modalism or patripassianism. So he took it slow. He let the needed people know stuff, but he didn't get really clear about it until right before the end in front of the authorities when it was time for him to go to the cross.
Mark, thank you. Appreciate the question. It's open forum. This one comes from Anastacio. Is there another meaning of baptism other than immersion?
Yeah, so the Greek verb baptizo can mean several different things. It can mean immerse. It can also mean dip, and it can mean wash, among other things. There are other meanings of the word that are even farther afield. The question is, what did it mean in a Christian context? And what did it always mean to immerse in a Christian context, so that you had to immerse someone in order to baptize them? Or could it mean other things, like just wash, where you don't have to immerse someone in order to baptize them? Well, we know the answer to this because it's found not in the New Testament, but in another Christian document that dates from the 1st century. The document is known as the Didache, or it's sometimes called the Teaching of the 12 Apostles. That's what Didache means, is teaching. And in the Didache, it has a discussion of how you baptize people. And it says, well, if you have living water, by which they meant running water, baptize them in the running water. You got a stream or something, baptize them in the stream. If you don't have living water, then but you do have standing water, then baptize them in the standing water. So you got a pool of water. It's not running, but it's a pool of water. You can baptize them in that. Doesn't tell us how you do that, though. Doesn't tell us, are you dunking them? Are you immersing them? Or are you doing something else? But the third thing it says does tell us about the mode of baptism, because it says if you don't have living water or standing water, pour water on their head 3 times. So right here in the first century, we have pouring as a legitimate, or what's sometimes called infusion, as a legitimate mode of baptism in the Christian community. So the term baptizo or baptizo, depending on how you want to pronounce it, it had a range of meanings, but we know that in the Christian community, in the sacramental context, it did have a semantic range that included pouring.
All right. Anastacio, thank you. We got to take a break. More to come. Open forum today, internet open forum. Lots more great questions right after this for Jimmy Akin on Catholic Answers Live.
Bringing you the truth. Catholic Answers Live.
Do you have a question but prefer to ask it privately? Catholic Questions can help. Go to CatholicQuestions.com to ask your question online, email us, drop us a letter, or give us a call. Longtime Catholic Answers Live apologist and author Jim Blackburn or another Catholic Questions apologist will be happy to assist you. Catholic Questions proudly supports Catholic Answers Live, so visit us at CatholicQuestions.com today. That's CatholicQuestions.com.
The most original and exclusive Catholic content is on EWTN Radio.
What a great grace it is to have the opportunity to use the airwaves for the honor and glory of God, to be able to talk to the hearts of individuals and meet them where they are in their relationship with our Lord, and also to encourage them forward.
Women of Grace with Johnette Williams. This morning, 3 a.m. Eastern on EWTN Radio.
Welcome back to Catholic Answers Live. It's an open forum today, and Jimmy Akin is our guest. Jimmy, of course, senior apologist here at Catholic Answers and the proprietor of Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World, a very popular part of the internet that many people have become fans of. Probably, all right, I always forget how many, but I think you're probably coming up on like several hundred. I mean, I know that we don't know exactly when this. Episodes. Like you've got hundreds of episodes now, right?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
We already have. By the time this Evergreen show goes live, we're already going to have more than 300 numbered episodes, in addition to bonus episodes that aren't part of the regular numbering system.
Yeah, I said one time that you had more episodes than the Carol Burnett show.
We do. Yeah, Carol Burnett topped out around between 270 and 290. So we passed her a while back.
Yeah. So you can check it out at, we'll just put Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World. If you put probably Mysterious World, Jimmy Akin, whatever, into your...
Or mysterious.fm.
Or just go to mysterious.fm and find out what everyone is enjoying so much at Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World. But we've got Jimmy here for an open forum this hour, and this one comes from Matt. Jimmy, who is Father Malachi Martin? And is there any legitimacy to his prophetic claims, the end of the pontificate, I think, after the 112th Pope, or the extension of the third secret of Fatima, which I remember you mentioned in one of your episodes on Fatima, or his covert description of the church and certain bishops in a windswept house? I know it's a lot, but as a priest, I'm often struggling with trying to help parishioners in the more traditional movements concerning this subject.
So I think there may be some confusion going on here between Father Malachi Martin and the prophecy of the popes, which was attributed to Saint Malachi. Saint Malachi is a different guy. He lived in the Middle Ages in Ireland. And he also his name is also spelled a little differently. It's Malachi with a Y rather than Malachi with an I. And Saint Malachi is credited with this thing called the prophecy of the popes, which is basically a list of descriptors of different popes that are ostensibly a prophecy from Saint Malachi's time in the Middle Ages through kind of now, because if you assume every, there are no gaps, and these guys are all so-and-so is the successor of so-and-so in the papacy, we're basically out of popes. and on the list. And the last one on the list is supposed to be a guy named Peter the Roman. Now, there's some doubt about, is there a gap in the list, like towards the end of it? It's not 100% clear. So it's possible that there's a skip where you go through the end of the prophecy of the popes, and then there's a skip to the very last one, Peter the Roman. But we have to, like with any claim of a prophecy, we have to say, okay, what's the evidence for this? What is this a genuine prophecy or not? And we always start in any paranormal or supernatural investigation with the natural hypothesis that the explanation for this is natural, unless we can discount all of the natural causes that could explain it. So what are the natural causes that could explain something like this? Well, chance is one of them. It could be that these descriptions of the popes, now they don't contain their names typically. Peter the Roman is an exception. It uses the name Peter. But most of them say things like glory of the olive or labor of the sun or something. And so you kind of got to match the name to something about the descriptor, to something about the Pope other than his name. And so could this just be due to random chance? The successes on this list. Well, that raises the question of how many successes are there? How many of these descriptors seem to be plausibly linked to the particular Pope that they ought to link with? Well, I've done a study of that. And it's at my website, jimmyakin.com. So if you search for Prophecy of St. Malachi and Jimmy Akin, this will come up. There's a shorter summary, and then there's a longer treatment where I go through every single one of the prophecies, all like 100 plus of them. And I assign them to one of three categories: hit, miss, or vague. It's a hit. One of these entries is considered a hit if there is an obvious correspondence between the description and some notable fact about the Pope's life, something that's fairly obvious to see. It's a miss if there is no obvious connection to the Pope in question. And it's vague if it doesn't clearly fall in either one of those two categories. So what I found when I went through the prophecy of the popes is you have a remarkable string of hits all the way down from St. Malachi's time to the time of Urban V in 1590. There are no clear misses in that time frame. There are only a handful of vague ones. The overwhelming majority of the descriptors between St. Malachi and 1590 are hits. And then everything changes. After 1590, misses predominate. There are basically no hits, and there are a few vague possible maybes in that time frame after 1590. So what we see is a radical change in the hit rate of these prophecies. Down to 1590, they are, with very few exceptions, dead on. After 1590, they are, with very few exceptions, dead off. And that suggests another natural explanation, not random chance. Random chance is probably the explanation for things after 1590. But the overall explanation for this list is fraud. In fact, what we're looking at, the evidence would suggest, is a vaticinium ex eventu, or a prophecy made after the fact for the popes before 1590. What almost certainly happened in this case is someone around the year 1590 decided they wanted to come up with this prophecy of the popes document, presumably as a way of maybe just for yucks, just because they wanted to have fun, but possibly also because they wanted to influence a papal conclave. because Urban V just reigned very shortly, and they were going to have a new conclave. And if you have this prophecy that supports this other candidate, and you could get your guy elected Pope, and if you've got a prophecy supporting his election, but it shouldn't just end now. So we'll tack on some extra names. So it looks like, and we'll attribute it to this guy that lived hundreds of years ago in Ireland, St. Malachi. So and then we'll salt it into some records at the Vatican, and we can discover it right before the conclave. And hey, it seems to be pointing to we ought to vote for this guy. So it's possible that it was a forgery that was intended to influence a papal election, or it could be something else. But one way or another, it looks like whoever wrote this document was not St. Malachi. It was someone living in around 1590. They looked at a list of prior popes and made up accurate descriptions for them. But going forward, they didn't have any supernaturally knowledge of future popes, and that's why the hit rate plummets spectacularly at 1590, and any possible correspondences after that seem to be just random chance. So it looks like this is not an actual prophecy from St. Malachi. This is a forgery. The first half of it, pre-1590, is Vaticinium ex eventu. The latter half of it is just random chance. But it doesn't look like this is an accurate prophecy at all, and so I would not give it any credit at all. And if you want to read more about that, Father Matt, just Google Jimmy Akin, Prophecy of St. Malachi with a Y. Now, when it comes to Malachi Martin, he was a guy that lived in the 20th century. He was from Ireland, and he became a priest and a Jesuit. And then he wasn't. He left the Jesuit order, possibly kind of under a cloud. He also... There are different stories about, was he laicized, or did he still have permission to celebrate the sacraments? And there's some dispute about that. I have not done the research I would want to do yet to settle that question. I may well do an episode of Malachi Martin in the future on Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World, but I haven't yet been able to sort out all of these questions. But he left the active priesthood. He claimed to still have permission to celebrate the sacraments. He was no longer a Jesuit. He started writing books, and his books changed over time. He wrote like a history of the Jesuits. He wrote some other things in the 1970s. And when you read his stuff from the 1970s, he's coming off like a liberal. And then he starts writing books about exorcism and about conspiracy theories involving John Paul II and skullduggery at the Vatican. Windswept House is a novel that he wrote allegedly based on a kind of treatment center for priests that had been, committing abuse. And so he has this kind of pivot. He has several pivots. I mean, first he's a priest. He's even an associate of Cardinal Bea during the Second Vatican Council. Then after the council, he's writing like a progressive, and then he pivots and becomes a conservative. What it really looks like is he's an opportunist. That his message changed based on what he could get clicks for at the time. In the 1970s, I mean, they didn't have clicks back then, but, in the 1970s, the progressive theology was trendy. And then the exorcism and conspiracies about liberal skullduggery, that's trendy, and he shifted. So it looks like he's kind of a theological opportunist. When it comes to something like Windswept House, well, okay, I have no problem believing there are treatment centers, for priests who have had problems to go and recuperate and take a sabbatical and maybe get psychological treatment and things like that. So he very well could have heard rumors about such a facility and written Windswept House, but it's a work of fiction that's based on rumor. So don't take anything it says super seriously, because it's not going to be super accurate. It's imaginative fiction to begin with, and the factual basis is rumor-based. So there's going to be lots of distortions, and as an author, he's unconstrained by needing to keep things close to reality. He can make up something and put it in the story just because it's more dramatic. to propose this happened rather than what we actually have evidence happened. So I am afraid I view Malachi Martin with a lot of suspicion and don't consider him a particularly reliable individual in any of the phases of his career, whether it was when he was a priest or after he was a priest when he was a progressive, or after he was a progressive when he was a conservative. I don't really have a lot of confidence in this guy one way or another.
Thank you very much, Matt. I hope that was helpful to you. Well, thank you very much. I'm going to read the next one, Jimmy. I don't know. There may not. Well, we'll see how we do on time.
Read it, and we'll see how we do.
Hello, Jimmy. When God created Adam and Eve, how old were they? Thank you, and God bless.
Well, if we assume that the text is literal, so that they were created, not born, then, well, they clearly weren't babies, because babies cannot take care of themselves. So they had to be old enough to take care of themselves, at least in a paradisical environment where there aren't a lot of struggles. So they would, I would say they'd minimum, they'd need to be older children. But since they're told to be fruitful and multiply, if they're meant to start doing that anytime soon, I would assume they're also of reproductive age at the time they began. There has been some speculation that 33 is the ideal human age, in part influenced by that's how old Christ was. And so there have been people who speculated they were physically 33, and that's possible, but ultimately we don't know, and that's even taking this text literally.
Mark, thanks for that question. Right back with more Open Forum with Jimmy Akin.
When the resurrected Jesus appeared to disciples on the road to Emmaus, they didn't recognize him until the breaking of the bread. The same is true today. In the Holy Eucharist, we really meet Jesus. In The Eucharist is Really Jesus, author Joe Heschmeyer explains how knowing Jesus in the Eucharist is the key to understanding all of Christian faith. Order your copy of The Eucharist is Really Jesus today at shop.catholic.com or get it at a good Catholic bookstore.
Our Lord needs articulate defenders of the truth to spread the joy of the Catholic faith. Catholic Answers monthly giving club, Society 315, helps you fulfill the call in 1 Peter 3:15 to always be prepared to make a defense for the hope that is in you. For as little as $10 a month, you'll help Catholics grow in faith, bring lapsed Catholics home, and lead non-Catholics to the truth. Go to casociety315.com and join today.
Is relativism dead? It sure seems dead. Each day, new moral demands are made, and they are presented to us as absolutes. Everything, from transgender ideology to physician-assisted suicide, is presented as a moral good that all right-thinking people must accept. But Catholic Answers' own Carlo Broussard says look deeper, and you will see today's moralism is just relativism dressed up in new clothes. Carlo's eye-opening book, The New Relativism, shines a light on how the sacred moral teachings of this age cover up a deep denial of moral truth. Order your copy of The New Relativism today at shop.catholic.com and be prepared to defend the truth against aggressive relativism. The New Relativism at shop.catholic.com or ask for it at a good Catholic bookstore near you.
Welcome back to Catholic Answers Live. Thank you so much for being here with us. Jimmy Akin is here with us, and it's open forum, and all the questions have already been submitted. It's an internet open forum. And Brett says this: I've been keeping a list because I always forget my questions when you ask. Here are two. All right, the first one is this: are there any extra biblical writings that we possess which we are fairly sure were written by people who knew or interacted with Jesus or who are mentioned in the Bible?
There are no extra biblical writings that we have that we are at all confident were written by people who knew or interacted with Jesus. The only writings that fit that description are in the Bible themselves. Like, for example, the Gospel of John is clearly written by an eyewitness. someone who knew Jesus. It's written by the beloved disciple. You can debate exactly who the beloved disciple was. Was it John, son of Zebedee, or was it someone else? But it's clearly written by someone who knew and interacted with Jesus. And the same is true for, at least appears to be true, for Matthew's gospel and for the letter of James and the letters of John and the 2 letters of Peter. Beyond that, it was people who, so far as we know, didn't interact with Jesus personally, but were kind of one step removed from Jesus. They were either they were associates of people who did know Jesus. When it comes to, are there documents that were written by people who are mentioned in the Bible? Well, okay, sure. I mean, we've got like stuff that Augustus Caesar wrote. And stuff that Tiberius Caesar wrote. So we have stuff like that. But I assume you mean something that was written within the Christian community, Christians who are mentioned in the Bible. And the answer to that is maybe. One document that seems to have been written or begun to be written about the year 80, so about 10 years after the destruction of the Jewish temple, is known as the Shepherd, and it's attributed to a guy named Hermas, who's named in the document itself. So it's also called the Shepherd of Hermas. And Hermas, according to at least a couple of early Christian writers, early church fathers, is the Hermas that's mentioned by Paul in Romans 15. So Romans is written about the year AD 54. And Paul mentions, as he's greeting all these people, he's never been to Rome, but he knows the names of a lot of people in Rome. And I assume the reason he knew their names, that he knew how to greet all these people he'd never met, is because he was using a scribe from Rome to write the letter, Tertius. And Tertius is already known to the Romans, and at one point he salutes the Romans himself and says, "I, Tertius, who wrote down this letter, salute you." And so the Romans knew who Tertius was, and my guess is the reason that Paul wrote Romans is because he's here in Corinth, he's planning to go to the Holy Land next, but then he wants to go to Rome on his way to Spain. And lo and behold, while he's in Corinth and preparing to go back to the Holy Land, this Roman dude, Tertius, shows up, and he's a scribe. He knows how to write. So, okay, Tertius, I want to write a letter to Rome, and I want to say howdy to all the churches in Rome. So let's go through your memory of the different house churches in Rome and the names of the people in them, and I'll greet every one of them in chapter 15. Which is what he then does. And you can even tell the structure by looking at the groupings of names. You can tell these people are going to this church and these people are going to this other church and stuff like that. So you get a little map of what the Roman church is like in AD 54. And one of the people who's listed is this guy named Hermas. Well, then we have another guy from Rome named Hermas about 80. So this is like, 20-something years later, writing this book, The Shepherd. And according to various early church writers, not a huge number, but according to a few, that's the Hermas from Romans. So it's quite possible that The Shepherd of Hermas is a book written by someone, a Christian, who's mentioned in the Bible. There's another book that's attributed to, First Clement. Clement of Rome is mentioned apparently in like Philippians, and we have the letter to the Corinthians that Clement wrote on behalf of the Roman clergy. So it looks like that's another one from someone who's mentioned in the New Testament, a Christian who's mentioned in the New Testament. And then there's another work that's attributed to Barnabas. Barnabas is mentioned in the book of Acts, and in a few of Paul's epistles, but he was another apostle. He was an associate of Paul. Luke refers to Paul and Barnabas both together as apostles, so Barnabas is included in that. And we have this letter known as the letter of Barnabas that is in the early church commonly attributed to Barnabas. Now, a lot of modern scholars reject that claim and say this is not really by Barnabas. But I want to know how they know that. I haven't. Modern scholarship has been entirely too skeptical of traditional authorship attributions, and so I have yet to study the matter. And I could, upon studying it, conclude, yeah, this isn't really by Barnabas. We don't know who wrote it. But I think we need to be open to the idea that it may have been written by Barnabas, and I want to see arguments to overcome the presumption that it was written by Barnabas, given that's how it's attributed in the early church. At this point, I don't see any reason why Barnabas couldn't have written it. But I, as I said, need to study the evidence further.
Okay, so that was the first question from Brett. And Brett, thank you very much for that question. Here's his second question. What programs or books or where for classes would you suggest for someone to learn biblical Greek, Latin, or Hebrew? If you ever consider writing an academic commentary or any of the books of the Bible, please do so. I'll gladly buy 2 or 3.
Yeah, well, I've written not academic commentaries, but sort of mid-level commentaries on some of the books of the New Testament. I'd like to write them all eventually, on each book of the New Testament. So far, only Mark has come out, but that's available on Logos Bible software. When it comes to language learning resources, you mentioned Greek, Latin, and Hebrew, and I'd have different answers for each one. So I'll tell you what I studied, and then I'll give you my thoughts on it. For Greek, I began with the Basics of Biblical Greek by Bill Mounts, and I really liked it. It has a lot of really good features. It's very innovative. You start reading biblical text from the first, from the beginning of the book. You're actually reading part of the Bible, which is a big motivator as opposed to just reading made-up sentences in Greek. And it teaches you the vocabulary in focusing on the most frequent words. So the words that you're learning are the ones that are most useful to you. It's not just teaching you obscure words to be complete. It's teaching you, here are the most common words in the New Testament. Let's learn some of them. Mm-hmm. And so that's really good. And there's a kind of a sequence that develops from Basics of Biblical Greek. There are some associated books, that some of which were also written by William Mounts. There's also a higher level book written by Daniel Wallace called Biblical Greek Beyond the Basics, which is a more advanced grammar. And there are a bunch of handy resources like books of readings and stuff like that to help you practice. When it came to Latin, I learned from Collins's Latin grammar, and I as part of private tutoring, and I hated it. I absolutely hated Collins's Latin grammar. I thought it was, I forget, it's called something like a primer on ecclesiastical Latin, but I hated it. It has loads of made-up examples, and it teaches in a way that I did not find congenial at all. When it comes to Hebrew, there is a Basics of Biblical Hebrew course that's put out by the same publisher and uses a similar methodology to Mounts's Basics of Biblical Greek. Also, since Hebrew is a revived language, it hasn't changed a whole lot, not grammatically and not vocabulary-wise, over the last 2,000 years. It kind of got frozen in time and was used only by specialists, and then became popular again in connection with the founding of the State of Israel. So you can actually learn modern Hebrew, and it'll give you a lot of biblical Hebrew at the same time. It's not like you can't learn modern Greek, and that's not going to give you a huge amount of ability to read the Greek New Testament. It'll give you some, but not a huge amount. Whereas Hebrew, the language hasn't changed as much because it was kind of in the deep freeze for a long time. So I actually like the program sequence for Hebrew put out by Pimsleur, Pimsleur. It's an audio program where you listen to native speakers and repeat what they say, and then it puts the burden on you based on what you've learned. Okay, you learned how to say this to a man. You learned how to say how to modify things to say it to a woman. Now tell us, how would you say this to a woman? And you've got to figure that out for yourself. So it makes you use the language, not just repeat it. It puts you in the position of composing sentences in the language. And only after you've had your guess at how you would say it do they tell you. So it's a very good system. They start each lesson, which is like, the lessons are 30 minutes long. They start each lesson with a little conversation, and then they teach you how to understand everything in that conversation. And it's based on the things you're going to need to know the most, the first. So the first thing you learn in any Pimsleur course is how to say, excuse me. Because as a new language learner, you're going to need to say, excuse me, a lot, both to get people's attention and to apologize for things you got wrong. But Pimsleur Modern Hebrew is a good course. There are some limitations to all of these. None of them are exactly what I would recommend if I were composing a course. One of the things, and I think there are starting to become books like this, but one of the things that I would teach differently in any of these languages is, any of these ancient languages, is I would focus on recognition rather than composition. You do learn a language better if you can compose text in that language, like figure out how would you say this. But that's not what most people wanting to read biblical Greek or Latin or Hebrew are interested in. They're not interested in composing new text. They're interested in understanding the text that's in front of them. And so if I were writing a language course on one of these languages, I would focus on, here's what you need to recognize the meaning of what's in front of you. So it would be recognition based rather than teaching you how to compose in this. To give an example, like in Latin, the sound b gets shoved into verbs to make them future tense. And so you don't need to know every single thing about how to conjugate every verb in the future tense. All you got to know is if you recognize a verb, but it's got the letter B shoved into the middle of it before the ending, that makes it future tense. So you don't have to memorize a big verb paradigm. Just remember that a B in a verb, if the verb doesn't normally have a B and it's got one in there, you're looking at a future tense verb. So that will teach you to recognize future tense verbs rather than how to make future tense verbs for yourself. I also would do other things like in Greek, they have the definite article. Their equivalent of the word the is very important, and it takes on different genders. There's a masculine the, a feminine the, and a neuter the. And frequently, they will put it, when you're learning Greek vocabulary, they'll put the noun first, and then to let you know what gender it is, they'll stick the after it. So you would have, in a typical Greek vocabulary learning program, logos, which is the word for word, logos ha. And ha tells you this is a masculine word. Logos is masculine. Well, that's dumb, because you're never going to encounter logos ha when you're reading the biblical text. In Greek, it sticks the in front of the noun it modifies. So what we ought to do is teach students Greek vocabulary by putting the definite article in the correct place. Ha logos. Because that's the way you're always going to encounter it in the text. Ha logos, not logos ha. And so I think sticking the definite article on is good, but you need to stick it on in the right place where the student's actually going to encounter it, so they memorize what they're actually going to be seeing in the text. But those are my thoughts.
Brett, thank you for those questions. That does bring us to the break. We'll take a quick break. Be right back with more Open Forum with Jimmy Akin on Catholic Answers Live.
Hang on. Catholic Answers Live will return in a moment.
Underwriting for Catholic Answers Live is provided by Real Estate for Life. Real Estate for Life connects homebuyers and sellers to real estate agents while supporting pro-life organizations. On the web at realestateforlife.org.
One of the biggest mistakes a Christian can make is to try to do good without God's help. St. Therese said, when we trust only ourselves and not God, our soul becomes incapable of virtue. Her remedy? Works of charity. And the greatest work of charity is to share the gospel. At St. Paul Street Evangelization, a Catholic nonprofit, we encourage you to share the gospel with someone who doesn't know Jesus. Catholic Answers is supported in part by St. Paul Street Evangelization, streetevangelization.com.
Catechism in a Year with me, Father Mike Schmitz, is now available right here on Catholic Radio. Encounter God's plan of sheer goodness for us, revealed in Scripture and passed down through the tradition of the Catholic faith, as we journey together toward our heavenly home.
Bible in a Year and Catechism in a Year with Father Mike Schmitz, tonight at 10 p.m. Eastern, 7 p.m. Pacific on EWTN Radio.
Welcome back to Catholic Answers Live. Jimmy Akin is our guest, and it's an internet open forum. And Trey wants to know this. Is Frank J. Sheed's explanation of the Trinity good theology?
Frank J. Sheed was a 20th century apologist and author who was originally from Australia, but married an English woman and founded a publishing company called Sheed and Ward. His wife's name was Maisie Ward, and they founded a publishing company called Sheed and Ward in England. He also wrote a bunch of books, and two of his books are called Theology, Insanity, and Theology for Beginners. And both of these books contain explanations of the doctrine of the Trinity. It's been ages since I've read Sheed, but my memory is that his explanation of the Trinity is considered good. That doesn't mean perfect, and it certainly doesn't mean that everything he says about it is church teaching, but it is considered to be a good, reputable explanation of the Trinity. So with those cautions in mind, I'd say, take a look at it and see what he has to say.
Thank you, Trey. This one comes from Aaron. Does blessing something require authority over it? I wondered about this because I'm studying to become a librarian, but I currently work in the library as an assistant. Am I more qualified to bless the library as a librarian rather than just an assistant? Or as a mom, I bless my children. Can I bless other people's children?
Well, okay, so let's think about what a blessing is. The Latin word for blessing is benedictio, and that means literally from its word parts, its etymology, it means to speak good. And so what you do when you're blessing something, this is opposed to maledictio, malediction or cursing, where you speak evil of something or speak bad of it. So in a curse, what you're doing is you speak bad of it and you hope the bad thing will happen. Like some of Johnny Carson's, may 1,000 fleas infest your armpits or whatever. That would be a curse. And a blessing is the opposite, where you speak good of something in hopes that the good will happen. Like, may something nice happen to you today. So we, as human beings, unless you're using psychokinesis, we as human beings don't have any ability to affect things. We can't bring about harm or good for someone just by speaking it. And so we're relying on God to bring about either the blessing or the cursing. And so the question is going to be, in terms of, is a particular blessing going to be effective? It's going to be, well, does God want to answer that prayer? Because essentially that's what you're doing when you are uttering a blessing, is you are basically praying to God. If you say, God bless you, Psychelet, what I'm doing, even though I'm addressing you, I'm really hoping God's going to do something. So it's the equivalent of saying, oh God, please have something good happen to Psychelet. So that means that in order to determine the scope of who could bless things, in principle, we can ask the question, who can pray for things? Because you could always address God directly and say, God, please may something nice happen to Psychelet today. And God could answer that prayer. But that's essentially the same thing. If I just say, may God bless you today, Cy.
Mm-hmm.
That's the same thing. So anybody can pray to God for good things to happen, either for themselves or others. And so anyone in principle can say a blessing on someone else. Now, that doesn't mean that they're authorized to do so in particular circumstances, like in the Mass, the priest is assigned to do blessings, and we're, as laity, are not assigned to do blessings, and we're supposed to keep to our role in the Mass. So we as laity don't give blessings during the Mass, but the priest does. But unless there's a restriction in a particular case, anybody can pray for anything. It's just like at the Mass. At Mass, the priest says the prayers. The laity don't say the prayers with the priest. But unless there's a restriction, anybody can pray for anything and anybody can bless anything. So you can bless your children. You can bless the books in your library, even if you're not the head librarian, because all you're really doing is praying to God, asking for good stuff. And anybody can do that. Having said that, some people are authorized to give blessings, like priests, and in some situations laity, including the blessing of one's own children. And so there's a certain appropriateness to people with authority over something trying to bless it. It might have a little more effect if it's coming from someone with, like, a parent's natural law authority over their children, or a priest's authority over his flock, or something like that. But ultimately, it's up to God. So it might be more effective if someone has authority, but it can be done by anybody, and it's ultimately up to God to decide what to do.
Aaron, thank you for that question. Getting near the end, so on we go to Jean's question. I had a discussion with a Baptist who believed in Baptist successionism. Okay. I know that's been debunked, even by other Baptists.
Yep.
But he threw at me a Jesuit oath, which he claimed showed how bloodthirsty and horrible the Catholic Church is. I looked online for this and found what he was referring to, but it is so over-the-top inflammatory that I can't believe it's anything but a hoax. But he says it's real and is in the Library of Congress, as though placement there imbues the document with authenticity. Could you please tell me more about this Jesuit oath?
Sure. First, I should, though, explain what Baptist successionism is for people who don't know that term. The idea is that Baptists as a denomination have existed since the 1st century. Sometimes they'll even say they were founded by John the Baptist, hence the name. And this claim was popularized in the early 20th century by a booklet called The Trail of Blood, which was released in 1931 by a guy named James Milton Carroll, who was a Baptist minister. And in The Trail of Blood, he proposes, and he actually has a chart illustrating this, that various groups in church history, like the Bogomils and the Paulicians and so forth, were actually Baptists. They were just called something else, and they were all persecuted by the evil Catholic Church and so forth. This has been, as you say, widely debunked. What Carroll did was get groups that were disfavored and had like maybe 1 or 2 points of commonality with Baptists and said, oh, they were us. They just had a different name. Really, though, historians look at this and say, no, they're not you. They had a bunch of other beliefs, too, that are not remotely, and practices. They had beliefs and practices that are not remotely like modern Baptists. So this is just historical falderall. When it comes to the alleged Jesuit oath, yeah, it's a forgery, and it seems to have become popular in the 19th century as part of 19th century American anti-Catholicism. It's also paired sometimes with another oath attributed to the Knights of Columbus. And they're both really bloodthirsty. You know, they're swearing to, I'm going to kill Protestants and I'm going to do all this bad stuff. And I'm going to, rip out their intestines and boil them in oil and all this kind of nonsense. No modern historian takes this seriously. And you will have sometimes people say things like, oh, this is in the Library of Congress, as if that was proof it's authentic. And that sounded in the 19th century, oh, you mean Congress has this in its library? Wow, Congress is such a respected institution. Cy Kellett, is Congress today a very respected institution known for its scholarly accuracy?
It slipped a bit in that area. It slipped.
Yeah. And you know what they actually do in the Library of Congress? They register copyrights. So anything with a copyright goes into the Library of Congress. It doesn't have to be accurate. They've got the world's smallest copy of Old King Cole in the Library of Congress, but that doesn't mean Old King Cole was a real historical figure. They also maintain the congressional record in the Library of Congress. So if any crazy congressman wants to read anything out, it goes into the Library of Congress. And yeah, there have been crazy anti-Catholic congressmen who have read out the Jesuit oath before, but that doesn't mean it's accurate.
Gene, thank you. I hope that was helpful to you. That was a lot of fun. Jimmy, thanks for 2 fun hours.
My pleasure.
Even though I showed up a little late. We'll round it off to 2 hours.
You were here in spirit.
I was indeed. All right, we'll see you next time, God willing, right here on Catholic Answers Live.
And before we go, just one more reminder that if you like what you've watched, you can help me out by liking, commenting, and especially subscribing to this channel. I'm trying to grow it, and I'd really appreciate your help. Thank you, and God bless.